Uh, Thank you all very much for the incredibly warm welcome and for tolerating the technical difficulties. And I do just want to address one thing before I start my presentation today. And Bronwyn mentioned the political differences between herself and me. And certainly I suspect there are some real political differences between myself and many of the people in the audience today. And yes, in the last week, some of the issues that we're going to talk about this afternoon have become incredibly politicised. And I think that that does a disservice to just how widespread these concerns are. From the very first day that I started talking about these things called women's sex-based rights, I was contacted by people from across the political spectrum, not just people who have traditionally voted Liberal, but indeed ones who have said that they have always voted for Labor and the Greens and potentially always will vote for Labor and the Greens, but they have been concerned that there haven't been any voices until mine in our national discourse discussing these issues. So it certainly does go far and beyond any political barriers. And I thank all of you in the audience today that may not always identify yourselves as voting for the same party that I'm a member of, but I certainly appreciate your support in being here and the support of all of the wonderful speakers you'll be hearing from later on this afternoon. But it is a pleasure to be here in a venue that they tried to stop us from hiring, asking the questions that they tried to stop us from asking. And who do I mean when I say us? Well, I mean women and females. Well, women, comma, females. What questions are we asking? Are they awful, horrific questions that no reasonable person should be uttering? Or are they simple, basic questions about women's sex-based rights, services and protections that previous generations have fought for? Judge for yourself. Listen to the conversations today. Form your own opinions. But here's a question that I've been asking. Do Australian women and girls have the right to play single-sex sport? Here's another question. Do you believe that a service providing support to women who are victims of male violence or sexual assault should be forced by law to admit males identifying as women? And yet another question. Do you believe a male criminal should be housed in a women's prison? For the last year, the Victorian Women's Guild has been asking Victorian members of Parliament the Staniland question, which is, do you believe that male-sexed people have the right to undress and shower in a communal changing room with teenage girls? Let me remind you that child sexual abuse and sexual violence against women is at epidemic proportions in this country. And let me also remind you that there is no one single stereotypical and easily identifiable sex offender. But there is a long, long, long list of convicted sex offenders who got away with their crimes for a long time because nobody who knew them ever thought that they would be a risk to their victims. And there are two common themes when it comes to sex offenders. 97% are male, and all of them were people who had in some way or another access to their victims. And that's why single-sex spaces for women and girls are so essential. A character reference that a particular male or a group of males isn't a risk of harm to women is fundamentally unreliable. Many of the worst sex offenders that have ever been caught had a list of people who in good faith trusted them to be around children. Despite all of this, when asked by their female constituents in the Women's Guild whether male-sexed people have the right to undress and shower with teenage girls, only 4 out of 128 members of the Victorian Parliament said no. Have you ever heard of such mass cowardice? In an era where the sexual assault of women and girls is front and centre in public discussion, 97% of elected members in the Victorian Parliament are not willing to say that males shouldn't have the right to use the women's change rooms that your teenage daughters are using. And we must also remember the people who tried to cancel this forum and the man who reported me to the Anti-Discrimination Commission in 2020 for saying that women's sports change rooms and facilities were designed for females and should remain that way don't want any of these questions about women's single-sex spaces being asked. They don't want to acknowledge that by taking away the right to have single-sex spaces by allowing self-identification, you are undermining a safeguarding practice, the removal of which dangerous males can and will use to their advantage. We've already seen it happen in women's prisons all over the world, where male sex offenders have identified as women so that they can be housed with vulnerable women. And we know that women have been sexually assaulted in prisons around the world because of this. Putting male criminals in a women's prison is so clearly dangerous and wrong. Yet how did we end up in a situation where any discussion of this issue is shut down by activists claiming that it's an attack on trans rights to question these policies? If your automatic response to women asking for privacy and safety and single-sex facilities is to insist that it's all a conspiracy against you, I think you need to take a step back and realise that you are putting your own feelings above 50% of the population. If you're male, regardless of how you might identify yourself, single-sex women's spaces aren't a personal attack on you or your intentions. And if people are telling you that they are, then that's fundamentally false. Female-only facilities are simply spaces which don't allow entry to the sex which perpetrates 97% of sexual assaults, because that's a very real and obvious way to reduce the risk of assaults occurring in those spaces and to provide a sense of security and safety for women who may already have been victims of male violence and harassment. I do want to make one thing absolutely clear. My point is not that trans people are dangerous. I'm suggesting no such thing. The vast majority of trans people, just like the vast majority of the rest of the population, are decent, law-abiding people. But my point is that when you disconnect law and policy from reality, in this case, the reality of biological sex, then you are undermining sensible and necessary protections and creating loopholes that dangerous people can and will take advantage of. By refusing to acknowledge the legitimate and necessary reasons for women's single-sex spaces, by lobbying politicians and decision makers and asking them to deny women and girls the right to single-sex spaces, and by convincing the media that the women fighting for sex-based rights should be ignored and even denigrated, activists are demonstrating a contempt for women's rights. They are saying that people of the female sex do not have the right to set our own boundaries. They are saying that women and girls, instead of prioritising their own safety and privacy and dignity, must prioritise the feelings of males and make concessions of our rights to accommodate them. The concept that women must open up our spaces to males is wildly incompatible with the message that we're trying to teach young girls today, that you're entitled to be safe, whether you're at home or in public, that you should speak up if you ever feel unsafe, and that you don't ever need to let someone emotionally manipulate you into putting their feelings above your own welfare. How can we, as a society, have people on one hand advising us to always let someone know where you're going and how long you're going to be when you go out for a jog because there are dangerous men out there who might rape and murder you, but on the other hand say that if you see a male person entering a woman's toilet after a young girl, then you can't say anything because it's bigoted to assume someone's gender? How can we stay silent when we're constantly told to believe women and respect women? Yet if we ask for single-sex spaces, then we're the ones who are bombarded with violent threats and abuse. Why should we fail to call out the hypocrisy of a movement which claims that asking for sex-based rights for women is harmful, and then tells the women who are asking for sex-based rights that we should go and kill ourselves? And I'm not exaggerating here, this has happened. Over the last 2 years, I have heard the most horrific stories of women who've contacted me and shared those stories, being bullied by their employers, their sports governing bodies, their professional associations, simply for asserting their own sex-based rights and using accurate sex-based language when talking about women's rights. I've seen the death threats. I've seen the rape threats, the threats to ruin their lives and to have them fired from their jobs and made unemployable. And I've seen the media, the public service, parliaments and politicians turn a blind eye. I've sat in our national parliament and had the Office for Women tell me that any man who says he's a woman is a woman, which therefore must include a man who beat his fiancée to death and is killed 3 times. I've seen the Department of Health devote resources during the worst outbreak of the COVID pandemic to stripping the word woman out of a vaccination guide for pregnant women. These are real events happening to Australian women, events that I'm constantly told by left-wing journalists and politicians that I should be ignoring. But we're not going to ignore these issues, and we're not going to ignore the hypocrisy. We're not going to accept that it's a human right to enter a single-sex space or a single-sex sport specifically designed for the protection of the opposite sex. And that's why this forum's important. People haven't heard our views, and they haven't listened to our concerns about the erosion of sex-based rights and accurate sex definitions in law and in policy. Instead, they've been fed a bunch of lies and emotional blackmail and smears. A forum like this gives Tasmanians and those from interstate who have travelled to be here the chance to hear our views about why sex matters. You might hear someone say something today that you disagree with from one of our speakers, and I might too. That's what freedom of speech looks like in our democracy, and that is a good thing. But if you disagree that women are entitled to single-sex spaces and sports and services, I say to you, make that case on its merits. Spell out your position clearly about why women and girls don't need or deserve sex-based rights. Find an argument that doesn't rely on calling us TERFs or reporting us for hate speech or lobbying the local media to call us bigots. We've heard so many times in the last couple of years that we must listen to women, that we must believe women. Well, today, here is your chance. Thank you.